nice day to anyone who is listening to this. My name is Klaus Schlichte. I'm a professor of international relations and world society at the University of Bremen. And today we have the occasion to talk a practitioner of democratization, if I may say so, which is Frank Rusa from Uganda. Hello, Frank.
Hello, Klaus. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, glad and happy to have you here. And the third person around the table is Jude Kagoro. And Jude, you might introduce yourself with a few words.
Thank you, Klaus. I'm Jude Kagoro, also with the Ugandan background, and currently working at the Institute for Intercultural and International Studies at Bremen University, where I have been for 9 years, since 2013.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good to have you here, Jude, in general, but also right now as well.
Yeah.
Okay, Frank, let's talk first perhaps a little bit about your personal background. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you moved into this field and what you studied and how you became a practitioner of democratization, if this is a well-taken title for what you do. Go ahead.
So thank you so much, Klaus. I must say that I am very happy to be hosted at the Institute for Intercultural and International Studies, InIIS, here at the University of Bremen. It's my first time in this part of Germany, but I think it's a beautiful place. I'm already loving it here. Yeah, so as you say, my name is Frank Rusa, and for the last 20 or so years, I've been involved in one way or another working in the area of promoting democracy, deepening democracy, working towards establishment of a democratic culture in my country, Uganda. But just to let you know about myself, a little bit about my personal background. I was born in Uganda 47 years ago. In the time of Idi Amin, the whole world knows Idi Amin. So in 75, I was born in Uganda, raised in Uganda, went to school from my primary school, secondary school, and first degree in Uganda. I trained as a lawyer, served some time as a state attorney in the Directorate for Public Prosecutions for a couple of years. And then I joined the Uganda Electoral Commission as the head of its legal department in 2003. I joined the Electoral Commission at an interesting time. That was a time when the push for the transition from a no-party political system, which I'll be telling you a little bit about, that was in Uganda, to multi-party system was high on the agenda. So I was involved a lot in guiding the process of the transition from no-party politics to multi-party politics in Uganda, and was a first-hand witness of so many of the challenges that we had in making that transition.
Okay.
Presently,
excuse me, what years was this?
2003 is when I was the Electoral Commission between 2003 to 2006.
Okay.
And Uganda went through a referendum in 2005 to adopt a multi-party political system. So I was so involved in the processes leading to the adoption of the multi-party political system. And from then on, worked very closely in the international development side, on the donor side of supporting democratic efforts in Uganda, first with the multi-donor basket fund, and now currently I am the country director for the Netherlands Institute for Multiparty Democracy, which is a Hague-based international NGO that is focused on supporting emerging democracies, build strong political parties, responsive political parties, but also we work towards supporting inter-party dialogue processes. So yes, in a broad strokes, that is my story of my background, professional background. I went to school in Uganda, but later on I studied in the United States of America at Stanford University. I was a Draper Hills Democracy Scholar there in 2012. Later on, I joined the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. as a Reagan Fassel Fellow. This is a fellowship program awarded to democracy practitioners involved in democracy activism around the world. It's a very, very interesting program that is run at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington. I also went to Yale University as a Maurice E. Greenberg Fellow in 2016, where I had an opportunity to interact with students and faculty, especially on the question of democracy and its prospects in hybrid political societies like Uganda. I have done a master's in political public administration at Harvard University, so I have also had an opportunity to study in the United States. But really, as an interest, I'm really, really passionate about democracy and democracy work and building democracy in our part of the world. Of course, I have now come to realize that there are many lessons that I've learned along the way, which I think might make interesting conversation this morning.
Yeah, so you moved, so to say, through different positions. You said a state attorney, so public service in Uganda, then you were a member of the Electoral Commission, of the legal section of it, and perhaps you tell us a little bit about this experience. So what happened when you were in the legal section of the Electoral Commission in this early years of 2003, 2006?
I think our listeners at this point might benefit from having a brief background of the political context of Uganda. Mm-hmm. Uganda is a country in East Africa, got its independence from the British in 1962, and for the first 20 years of its life went through a lot of turbulent times, which were characterized by a military takeover in 1971, which brought Idi Amin to power. Then in the 80s, we had a guerrilla war raging on over that was sparked off by a dispute on the elections that happened in 1980, which ended in the coming to power of Yoweri Museveni, who's the current leader of Uganda, in 1986. And when he comes to power in 1986, he ushers in a no-party political system. His argument was that the difficulties Uganda had experienced since its independence days had been occasioned by politics that was mobilized around religious and ethnic cleavages, that was very divisive, and he thought maybe a no-party political system called the movement political system is what Uganda needed. So for the first 20 years, from 1986 to 1995, of Museveni's rule was a no-party political system. Everybody was quote-unquote conscripted to be part of a movement political system. He didn't want to call it a one-party political system.
But he said it's a system, but it's not a party.
He said it was a system and not a party, but in essence, it looked like a party because there were some people who said are not part of us, and there are people who are part of it. So it looked like an association of particular people. But that was what it was for all these years. Then in around the 2000, the late 90s and 2000s, Uganda was part of the global wave that was pushing for pluralistic politics across the world. And this social pressure came to bear on Uganda, and there was a lot of push within the old political parties that had been there since independence, calling for opening of the political space. This, combined with the pressure of the international community, forced President Yoweri Museveni to consider opening up the political space, and through a referendum in 2005, multipartyism was adopted. This was at a time when I was the head of the legal department at the Uganda Electoral Commission. It was an interesting time because it also, the ushering in of a multi-party political system through the referendum in 2005 also meant that for the first time, President Yoweri Museveni was going to be open to serious challenge from other political parties. Mm-hmm. And then around that time, one of the leading opposition politicians in Uganda, Dr. Kizza Besigye, who had been in self-imposed exile, decided to return to Uganda to found a political party to contest in the elections. And when he came to Uganda, he got charged in a criminal court for a couple of offenses, including treason, which attracts a death penalty, and including rape and a number of other charges. Mm-hmm. When he was charged with these offenses and arrested and thrown in jail, there was a big question in the public on whether he would be able or he would be allowed to run for president, because there was a lot of excitement that was in the air with his return from self-imposed exile in South Africa. Mm-hmm. Now, naturally, the Attorney General of Uganda then, in an unsolicited legal opinion, announced through the public media that Dr. Kizza Besigye could not stand for president because he had been charged with heinous crimes, which were very serious, and he does not think that a person like that should be on a presidential ballot paper. Mm-hmm. But then the public was saying, no, but the Electoral Commission is supposed to be independent. It should not be under the direction of any authority. So the question was taken to the Electoral Commission on whether or not Dr. Kizza Besigye could stand, even while he had been charged. The Electoral Commission, in turn, passed this question to the head of the legal department, who happened to be myself. And here I was, a 30-year-old, faced with the question of should the leading opposition candidate, who has been charged by the ruling regime, be allowed on a presidential ballot. Mm-hmm. And I said that, in my opinion, looking at the laws of Uganda, there was no impediment within the laws that would stop him, because as far as our legal system is concerned, like the rest of the Commonwealth, you are innocent until proved guilty. So I said, because he's just been charged and is not yet convicted, he should be able to be on the ballot. And indeed, the Electoral Commission agreed with me, and we nominated Kizza Besigye while he was in jail in 2006, something that really caused me so many problems at a personal level, leading later on to my resignation from the Uganda Electoral Commission.
Okay, but the others in the Electoral Commission supported your evaluation of the situation?
Yes, there was a bit of a problem, because when I gave that interpretation, the commission was split. The commission is composed of 7 commissioners. 3 of them disagreed with my opinion, but the other 4 agreed with my opinion, and they did not, at the end of the day, the majority took the day and they chose to stick with it. And I thought it was a very good thing, because it sort of gave the population hope and faith that this election could actually be free and fair. It may be worth noting that that election was one of the most closely contested elections, because the result of that election was President Museveni won with 59%, which has been the lowest electoral victory has ever posted ever since he became president. So some people think it was because of a big turnout, which had been occasioned by a feeling in the population that this election was going to be free and fair, and that the Electoral Commission
they could actually decide something by the election.
Yes,
yeah.
Which was very interesting. But anyway, for me, this led me to now move away from being a lawyer, just practicing law, into democracy work, because it was around that time that I got an opportunity to join the Deepening Democracy Program of the Democratic Governance Facility, which is a multi-stakeholder basket fund put together by several European development partners, as we call them in Uganda, to focus on supporting democracy. It was the largest basket fund supporting democratic efforts in Africa on the continent. It was about $100 million donor facility, so it was really big.
Okay, yeah.
So I was now working with it, focusing on the electoral integrity program and things like this. So, yeah, that is the story of how my experience at the Electoral Commission was, and why I now move into frontline democracy building work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this. This is really fascinating and interesting, but it also stirs a number of questions, of course. And to start with perhaps one, in your introduction, you qualified Uganda as a hybrid system. saying that, well, it might have qualities of more authoritarian political traditions, but there is also democratic elements. And I think anyone who has observed political life in Uganda over the last 20 years would agree it's not totalitarianism, right? There are many features of a purely democratic societies, like, I don't know, there is freedom of press and expression, and many Ugandans are very outspoken on the political situation. But on the other hand, there is also elements of, well, repression, and it's not that, as you described the situation already in 2006, free competition is not really what is happening, right? There's all kinds of hindrances, obstacles, and imbalances and asymmetries in political competition, quite obviously. Okay, so perhaps we can go a bit deeper into how Uganda politically actually works, because in the political science debates, what always annoyed me, you have all these kind of judgments that say, well, this is a non-so-and-so, and this is a defect whatsoever. So it's this ex negativo qualification. So, you know, we have all these labels that say this is not this, but what is it? And how does it work, right? That's actually the more interesting question. And there is politics in Uganda, right? There is a government, there is a society. Somehow Uganda is ruled, right? And the political system is not, how to say, I would say, sufficiently analyzed if you put the label hybrid on it, right? We do not learn yet how politics are actually done. And this is what I would like to talk to you about with, how to say, the background that, well, what does it take to have a democracy? Are the preconditions for democracy there in Uganda? And that's part of the big debate about democratization of the world. So do we need to have certain preconditions for a fully fledged democratic system? Or is this really a question of choice? And you could introduce, how to say, quotation marks, fully fledged modern democracy anywhere if you just want to have it. So that's a bit the background of the discussion we would like to have with you. And perhaps you tell us a bit about the features of the Ugandan political system, which is, of course, a big subject. But yesterday we talked about the parliament, for example. And I witnessed parliamentary debates in Uganda a couple of times, and I was actually pretty impressed by the openness and the liberty, and also the joy sometimes with which people participate in the debates. It is certainly not boring. Well, on first sight I thought, well, this is actually a very lively democracy, because in many other parliaments, also in Western democracies, you don't see the same kind of passion all the time. So perhaps we start with the parliament. How democratic is it, or how would you qualify it, or what's so special about it?
So it's a very interesting background that you have given, and I think for me, it points to the question of form versus substance. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at, from outside looking inside Uganda, you might be struck by the vibrancy of politics. I think that we have a very elaborate electoral system, sometimes I think too elaborate for our own good, because we just have too many politicians. I think by the last count, we could have about over 2 million elective positions in Uganda at various levels.
Which means every 20th Ugandan
one is a leader.
Okay.
Somebody is a councillor or a representative of people with disabilities, or a youth leader, or a women's leader, or a labor union leader, or some leader form of. There's a lot of voting and elections going on in Uganda. We have got a parliament with over 500 members of parliament, and it's a very vibrant parliament. If you switch on the radios and you hear talk shows, you may get the sense that there is a lot of freedom of speech, because people can say anything. Over the radios, they can criticize anyone. So there is that form. But when you look deeper, you realize that can be deceptive, because behind that form are some of the limitations to the aspirations of democracy, as many people in the West might look at democracy. Let me say that in Africa, we have understood leadership for a long time in a form, we came from societies that understood the chief, the village chief, the strong man, he's the protector, he's the provider, he is the guide of the community.
A senior male person who would lead.
Who would lead. That is the understanding of leadership. Be it in the clan system, be it in the tribal kingdom hierarchies, this is how people looked at authority. And they look at leaders as that one who is the provider. So even when they are choosing leaders, they will always, you'll find that the individual always becomes stronger than the political party. You'll find that President Museveni is bigger than the NRM. An individual, your individual personality, many times individual personalities go even and tower over political party affiliation. Now, my limited understanding of the evolution of political thinking in some of the places we look up to for inspiration when it comes to democracy is around the political thinking was evolved around interests. Either it is the interests of the workers or interests of the farmers or interests of some interests. It was some sort of interest that created political thinking. Now in Africa this is not true because we went and adopted a multi-party political system at a time when we have not properly synthesized and evolved political thinking to aggregate interests to form the bedrock from which political parties can mobilize and organize. So you find that what happens is that politicians will come and use political parties as vehicles, as electoral vehicles that they kick into action around election time, and after elections these vehicles go to sleep. So you'll find that outside election time there's hardly any activity going on in any political party, including the ruling party, because the party is just a vehicle to deliver a task during an electoral season. And after election seasons you find that there's hardly any politics going on in the parties. So therefore the leaders now use more of a system of political patronage, whereby they think in terms of it is better and easier to build support by just recruiting elites into the political camp. So you find that the target is, if you can get the religious leaders to support you, you get the tribal chiefs to support you, you get the cultural leaders to support you, you get the public opinion leaders to support you through material gifts and exchanges and opportunities and favors. It becomes easier to organize politics that way so you find that politics becomes a huge web of patronage. So in that kind of system, I have gotten a sense to realize that all our attempting to address or look at political parties as vehicles of alternative policies, of alternative ideas of governance, becomes a superficial sort of thing when we are talking about our country. Because the voters are not choosing leaders based on their ideologies, on their policies, because they feel that is so remote. That's very far from them. They vote for leaders based on what those leaders can do for them. In terms of, so leaders are spending time buying iron sheets for the schools, contributing to the churches, paying bribing voters openly, and spending money to do physical things that the voters should relate to when they are making political choices. So in a way, we are really grappling with evolving a politically responsive political parties, which are accountable to the voters through processes that can put policies and ideas at the center of political debate, because that's not what it is at the moment.
Okay, so instead of public policies that will be promoted by a party, and you would vote for the party because it says if we got elected we will introduce this and that policy on a general level throughout the country, you would have a personalized system in which someone is elected because that person would promise and deliver how to say,
private goods.
private goods, but not public good, but private goods.
Yeah, because
of a certain special small interests.
That's
a
right.
Symbolic strategy of doing something good publicly, so he would appear as the guy who had brought the, I don't know.
That's true. With also the promise that when I get into power, I'll even bring more. So that is the reason why whenever we're talking about cabinets in Africa, in Uganda in particular, a region will feel offended if none of their countrymen, their tribesmen or tribeswomen are given a senior position in government. Because they look at it, if somebody from tribe A is given a role as prime minister or as chief justice or as a minister of something, the region feels that our son or daughter has been given an opportunity to bring back to our region. So that is how it's interpreted. Then they say we are now part of the national cake because our son or our daughter has been given a position. As opposed to saying the party in power promised us this set of policies. We need to hold them to account to make sure that those policies are actually enacted. And so this is what has brought a lot of patronage politics, which has undermined the functioning of political parties as we would have expected them to be. So this is one of a very big challenge. But there is some little progress. Of course, we are not where we were at independence. But there is still a lot to be done if political parties in Africa are going to evolve into robust mechanisms of synthesizing alternative ideas about governance and being able to hold the holders of power in check while they're in power. So yeah, this is, so we call this big man politics in Africa, and that is quite the story in Uganda. Now, again, about the hybrid political situation in Uganda. Uganda, despite the fact that we have regular elections, and that every 5 years there will be an election coming up, people will choose, the turnover of members of parliament is really high. So you may think that that means that people have the capacity to change leaders, which is a bit right. But the real power in our country really is in the military. Despite the fact that elections happen, we all know that this government came to power after prosecuting a successful guerrilla war.
With military means.
With military means. And ever since they took power, the military has a constituency, is represented in the national parliament. And many times when there has been some sort of political stalemate, we have seen the military come in to break the stalemate. For example, there was a time when the parliament, when there was a struggle on removal of term limits, whether or not they should remove the age limit. You know, there was a provision in our constitution which was saying that a person above the age of 75 cannot run for president.
Yeah.
And President Yoweri Museveni had turned 75. So there was a push to remove that age limit in the constitution, and then there was a serious resistance on this age limit. When this struggle was going on and a lot of activism in parliament, we saw the military actually get into the precincts of parliament, and actually there was a lot of violence. So it was it had a chilling effect on the population, a reminder that power really lies in the military. Although you have all these things going for democracy, power really lies in the military. So there has always been that that idea hovering over the people's minds that ultimately it seems the military still has a lot of influence.
And that's a bit the historical lesson of Uganda, of post-independence Uganda. So whenever it got tight, you could see the presence of military or military action. And even now in the Museveni era, whenever there was a political tense moment, you would see in Kampala a lot more soldiers on the streets.
That is right.
It was visible.
It's very visible to the extent that in the minds of the average Ugandan today, it's almost like being a soldier is a necessary prerequisite for you to consider running for political office. There's a lot of talk right now that the president's son may be well positioned to take over from his father because he's now a general in the army, and because he's a general in the army, they think he stands a very good, of course in combination with other factors, even including the fact that his father is the president, may give him a bigger. So there's this whole thing of the military having a very big role to play in politics. So which has continued to be a feature of our politics, contributing to the hybrid nature of our politics.
Okay, but good. I mean, Jude has written extensively, like other scholars as well, on militarization of Uganda as a social phenomenon, not just a political. And of course, you could say, well, if the military has such a central position in the country's history, it's difficult to overcome its, how to say, institutionalized, habituated position. But still, the question remains, so why don't people vote along public policies or their aggregate interests? So Uganda, for example, is a country with, well, it is said everybody is a farmer, but everybody is also something else. But peasants and farmers are perhaps the economic power group per se, because many people work in agriculture, and the promotion of agriculture in Uganda, well, it's not very well developed. If you look into the central government's budget, I think the main economic sector gets about 4% of the budget, right? Which is ridiculous if you think at, how many people work in this and how central the development of, well, agriculture in Uganda actually is for most people's lives. But this is not an issue, right? I never heard any public debate in Uganda about agricultural policy. Although everybody is somehow involved in it. What's your take on this? How do we explain this, that this is not what is so obvious and, in the life worlds of millions of people, of the 40 million Ugandans, agriculture is so important. In politics it doesn't play a role. Nobody's ever come across with an agenda for the farmers or the smaller peasants. Although one would think from any theory of politics that this is their main interest, that they would, get access to capital, better marketing procedures, better seeds, fertilizers, whatever. What do you think about this? Why?
That's a very good question, and it is something that is very interesting to think about. I think that one is that the average Ugandan living in the countryside has very little access to the necessary information or even basic civic education to know about, to make the correlation between their circumstances and the politics, to make the connection between the politics and their life, their livelihood. To know that certain policies are necessary to improve your fortunes in life. Civil society and the civic life in Uganda is not that organized. We do not have sufficient spaces for the aggregation of thoughts and ideas, specific even to the farmers, or be it farmers association, be it farmers organizations, to be spaces for aggregation of interests. It has been also deliberate. The state has made it, all this vibrant politicking that you may hear about is at the national level. You'll be able to go to the radios, you will be able to have civil NGOs discussing governance issues in the capital city. These kind of conversations will not be tolerated in the rural areas. Every district in Uganda has got a resident district commissioner, or known as an RDC. Basically, this one is a representative of the president at the district level. And these RDCs all have decided to interpret their roles to be gateways or protectors of the interests of the president. You can read the political interests of the president and the ruling party at that local level. And so one of the things... Excuse me,
so this is perhaps something we need to elucidate a little bit, because this is not so common.
Yes.
So there is local administration, there is locally elected bodies in Uganda on different levels.
Yes.
But at the same time, there is something like a second system, so to say, of government, which is the RDCs, the resident district commissioners, which are, well, envoys, if you want, from the president. They're not locally elected, but they're centrally nominated and sent to these districts, and they have a look on what's going on politically in the respective district.
That's right.
Report directly to the president.
That's right.
Okay.
And how those people, you have used a very interesting word, envoys of the president. So how they look at their role is protecting the interests of the president at the local levels. And they are also the chairmen of the district security committee. So they oversee a committee which has the intelligence chief of the district, the police chief of the district, the army chief of the district, and all other security organs. And they use their offices to try as much as possible to prevent alternative political ideas at that level. So you cannot easily go as an opposition leader or as a civil society activist trying to criticize government programs at the lower levels. You'll get into trouble. So all these things have worked together to reduce the amount of information at the lower levels and also to influence political choices at that level. But that said, this other idea I told you about how the Ugandan looks at leadership in terms of looking for strong men and problem solvers. Our people are still looking at leaders as somebody who comes and promises them direct solutions. I will do this for you. I will build the well for you. I will build a school for you. I will do this for you. So they look at the leaders as opposed to the policies of any given political party. So there's still a lot of work to be done, especially in the area of civic education, either by civil society and other relevant actors, to bridge the knowledge gap within the population, for them to make the connection between how politics works out and make the connection between their way of life and livelihoods with the politics of the day. So there is an information gap there, which I think should explain why we don't see strong voices around agriculture, around education, which should be the concern of each and everyone. I used to go to my village and have conversations with village people, and sometimes they'd ask me questions when we would tell them about corruption, for example, and say, so and so has stolen our money. And the villagers would ask, what money are you talking about? We have never had money. How can you still have stolen our money? I've never had any money. So they don't even understand the concept of our money, because it doesn't make sense to them.
The government budget is their money, actually.
But they don't appreciate it like that. They don't understand it like that.
I understand. So we have talked about a couple of things now that might help us to explain why the situation is like it is. So the traditional role of the military in the political system of Uganda, patronage as a widespread practice, the personalization of politics, also the question of, why on the countryside, for example, aggregate interest is not so easily to be organized. How about poverty?
There's another principle before we go to poverty. There is the personalization of power. Now, over the years, because the regime in Uganda has been in power for now 35 years, the presidency has increasingly has consolidated power and become so overbearing and strong that the president is very, very strong in Uganda. It is beyond normally what you'd expect. Also, the personalization of power. So you find that almost all decisions in Uganda today have something to do with the president. Even if somebody wants to resolve a local conflict in the district, you will hear delegations going to see the president about it.
Okay, he must have days.
So he is involved in almost each and everything. So that in itself also has made it seems that things begin and end with the president. So, and a very powerful presidential figure has also created this kind of situation I was describing earlier. The hybrid. So that's another factor that needs to be understood if you're to understand the political context of Uganda. There's a very strong presidency that has a lot of power that is rotating around the individual.
Right. Daily in the media, every day you see a new picture of him in uniform or parenting children or breeding cattle or whatever. The president is always there.
Yes.
Okay, it's not unique. Uganda's not a unique case in that regard. That's something that we see in many countries as well, of course. Okay, but let's talk about poverty and the question of can democracy work in societies in which, well, we have poverty rates, according to the World Bank, that hover around 30% in Uganda. We have very contradictory numbers on this, but it's pretty clear, and you can see it. Well, there is, according to global standards, poverty, widespread poverty in Uganda. Would you say that plays a role for, well, can democracy work in a society with these poverty rates?
I think I would be interested to see a proper study done on this, but my impression is that the average person finds conversations around politics and democracy and choices so remote to their concerns, so far-fetched. Because if somebody is poor and is caught up in the struggle to find water, to find food, to find shelter, to take their kids to school, they find that they don't have time to go into the luxury of analyzing policies and who is better than the other. So poor people become easy. They become easy prey for voter bribery, for example. I have read reports that people are bribed for as little as 1,000 shillings. 1,000 shillings is about 25 cents. Yeah. So somebody is willing to sell their vote for 25 cents. Mm-hmm. That shows that if somebody can sell their vote for 25 cents, this person is not going to spend time to understand the different policy issues of the day. So poverty has broken, is a big barrier. I think it is a disincentive to the level of scrutiny that democracy, that is associated with healthy democratic choices. So definitely I would agree that poverty is a big hindrance. It makes people very vulnerable to voter bribery. It makes them very good targets for political patronage, because then they are willing to follow the man or woman who is promising to rescue them from their situation. It makes the young people very vulnerable to manipulation in the cases of electoral violence and things like this. So yes, poverty is a very big hindrance to a healthy democratic culture. Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on this poverty.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Frank, this is quite interesting. Also, me coming from Uganda, I think maybe this people being being bribed to vote, maybe does not work in isolation, because we have seen a lot of Uganda is one of these political systems where anyone can join at any time.
Yeah.
We've seen young boys from the university joining and winning against very rich people. In other words, those rich people can bribe. Some of them are seasoned politicians, they are ministers, but still these young people come in and poor people still vote for them. So what is your comment about that? Because I think for me it looks like the system is quite open and people can still win without money.
It is interesting that what you raise, and it's actually true, that it's not always the richest person will win the election. We have seen some relatively poorer people come on the scene as young people and defeat the rich big man. So in that regard, you're right. However, I also want to bring it from the perspective of it's our turn to eat, because there are some people who are saying we need to rotate the feeding trough. Okay. You have had your chance, you went to parliament, you made hundreds of millions of shillings, you have all this money now have a young man who's like us, it's also his turn to eat, we're going to send this one. Again, the calculation goes back to where do we stand a bigger chance of getting a share of the big cake. So we send this guy to go and also pick it, and then so again it's the politics of it's our turn to eat sort of dynamic. So that also plays out sometimes. Yeah.
Okay. And what we're calling private goods, also just taking up from there, I find it quite interesting, because I know in Uganda, for one to win elections, you have to do a lot of social things. You have to be present in terms of when people have lost their relatives, you have to be there. You have to sit around the fire and converse with people. You have to go and bury. You have to participate in wedding plans. even if it's not giving money per se, but you have to be present in their social activities, social lifestyles, to be part of.
Yeah, but of course you also know that when you attend a funeral, you're also going to announce a contribution.
Yes.
If you're a member of parliament at a funeral, you're going to be. You'll hear. My friends who are members of parliament have told me that even when they are not in the village, they have somebody who is permanently listening out, who has lost a relative, and they have a standard package. So every time somebody dies, they announce that the area MP is very sorry to hear about the death of so and so, and he'll be contributing the coffin, for example.
My question is, don't you think perhaps, okay, we try to copy a lot of things from other places, and here the politicians have an audience, and the audience has determined that, look here, for us burial matters.
Yes.
And for us the wedding matters. So don't you think it's important for Uganda and other African countries to think wisely on how to accommodate some of these social ingredients or social events and into the political system itself, so that
I think it is a question of
come up with a unique and tailor-made political system.
I think it goes back to our original conversation. The original point here that it is erroneous to presuppose that the way democracy works in the West is how to work in our countries because of the different lenses through which we look at leadership. So it is true that some people in our villages will think that a good leader is he or she who will mourn with you, who will share bread with you when you are bereaved, who will give you a blanket when you are cold, who will contribute school fees for your children. This is how they understand leaders. That, however, my father, for example, was a very well studied, went to school, had a master's degree, had made an attempt to do his PhD, was very widely well educated in the days when there were few people like that. And when he went to the village to campaign, one time he was campaigning to be a representative in the country's constituent assembly, the group that was going to make the new constitution. And he was competing against people who never went to school, and he thought it was an advantage to talk about his schools and what he had achieved in his life and what he could do for them in parliament. And nobody could hear that. They actually chose somebody who had not even a quarter of his education. And because that person was with them, with them during the burials, was a friend of so this is, I agree that there's that element too. So this whole idea of policies or alternative visions, what happens in parliament, I don't even know whether we have many people who have spent 5 years without saying a single word in parliament, but does not affect their political fortunes when they go back home to stand, because they have passed the other tests of being with the people, spending time with them, sharing the little they have, solving their problems, and this kind of thing.
Okay. Last topic, perhaps the role of Western countries, mostly, that, well, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, put pressure on the Ugandan government to change the system. There was, of course, domestic demand for this as well, so Ugandan opposition that demanded for a change. But now again with that question, so what kind of change would that be? Who's to decide what form is appropriate and what should change or be adopted in the Ugandan political system? There is quite a number of prescriptions or recommendations, mostly from Western countries, because others don't participate that much in the debate. So it's usually Western Europe and North America. At least I don't know of any, say, Hungarian or Bolivian contribution to that debate. So what do you think of this? Is this necessary? Does it help? Does it hinder? Should it be changed, the kind of approach of Western countries to co-shape, so to say, Uganda's political development? After all these years, I mean, you're 20 years you're in that.
So I think that
contacts and experiences. What do you think?
I like the use of the word co-shape. I like that idea, the word co-shape. I think what has been happening is it is definitely useful that countries that are democracies, that have good stories about democracy, go on to help other countries that are struggling democracies to become better democracies. And I think the investments the West has made in this regard have been very helpful. In many ways, they've helped, especially through issues of civic education and democratic education, and through civil society, NGOs, and all this. But maybe it's not enough because of the way it is framed. You know, this log frame approach.
Mm-hmm.
So a logical framework is developed in a Western capital because of maybe case studies from other countries and all this. And we tick the box to say, we have to have a vibrant civil society, we need to have a free media, we need to have an electoral commission that is strong, we need to have a parliament that is strong. All these are ingredients of a good democracy in a developed context. But these questions have just been discovered as talking about in this conversation of the society. Have we taken enough time to understand how politics and leadership is appreciated and works in this particular society? Have we taken time to think about the roles of unorthodox entities like the cultural leaders,
Mm-hmm.
the religious leaders, in building a culture of democracy? I know Western donors have been very fixated with the idea of working with NGOs and international NGOs, which are good. But what about working with other spaces that are closer to the grassroots?
Yeah.
Spending more time to understand how these people view leadership, the sociological aspects of things. I think that is a gap. That could be something we could look into. I don't have a particular prescription for it, but I think that we should not give up on this sort of. But the bottom line is that before we build sufficient consciousness within these populations about the role of politics in the equation of their ordinary life, how does politics come? How does politics mediate their normal day-to-day living? To them to appreciate the necessity of a good leader, the necessity of good policies, the importance, and how a party which takes into consideration your interests can actually change your story. So issues of civic education are still very strong, but how do we conduct this civic education? Who are the agents? What agencies should we work with in doing civic education that means sense? Maybe we want to start thinking about new partners in this kind of work. So I don't have a black and white answer to your question, but I think it is an area which calls for a case-by-case appreciation of the context better.
It's an argument against blueprint approaches.
Yes, you could say that.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Klaus, what Frank is saying, because this happened to me during my PhD research. I went with the mentality that militarization is bad, military dominance is crazy. Reaching the field disagreed with me completely, because I found people so much in love with the military idea. For them, a good leader should have military ranks, they
appreciated military attire and culture.
Appreciated the military culture, the political capital that comes with the military ethos and all the things. So basically what he's saying is quite important. I think we are always neglecting the society, as he's saying. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Perhaps we have contributed to this a little bit with this conversation. Thank you very much, Frank, for being here and spending time with us, and sacrificing your time. We did our best to have you here and present a good time at Bremen. Thank you, Jude, for organizing this, and I enjoyed this very much.
Thank you so much, Klaus, for having me, and I'm really glad for being at the Institute for the Intercultural and International Studies.
Thank you for this little promotion.